Okay, thank you, Jason. As I announced kind of before church this morning, we're going to go ahead and we're going to wrap up our biblical creation Bible study this morning. So we're going to kind of try to put a bow on it, and we've got to finish talking about a few of the last, I guess, loose ends that we haven't yet dealt with that we really need to address, I think, before we can kind of say, we've really taken a good look at the whole issue of biblical creation and evolution and the issues that are resolved. And the reason we've done this study is really because the issue of where do we come from? We as human beings, when we really get down to it, we've talked about all these things, everything from where do planets come from, and stars, and galaxies, and microbes, and all these kinds of things. We've talked about all these issues, but we're really interested most formally in where do we come from? Where do we as people, where do we come from? And it's really, obviously, it's a very hotly debated subject, both in the world of theology as well as in the world of science. We've talked how there's different worldviews at play, between the religion of naturalism, which says, what we observe in nature is all that there is, and so everything that is must then somehow be able to be explained through naturalism, versus various faiths, including our own, where God tells us where we come from. But what's really interesting is many Christians, or certainly secular folks, still struggle to adequately answer the question, where do we as humans come from? And so you've kind of got it there up on the screen. Our topic is human evolution, not evolution in general. Not talking about dogs anymore, no more horses and birds and dinosaurs, but what about us? What about people specifically? Okay? Now, many people try to make peace with where we come from through what I'd say one of two approaches. We try to make peace on where we come from by either being, of course, evolutionists and saying that there's an evolutionary ladder of which we kind of sit at the current top of, or, of course, the creation the way that God says. But for the evolutionists, they've still got to kind of soften the blow a little bit more than just that, because we say, well, okay, if we're an evolutionist, where do we as human beings come from? They say, well, you come from where? Where does an evolutionist say human beings come from? Most immediately. You've evolved from an ape, right? An ape of some kind. You have evolved from an ape. Now, on its face, personally, that seems kind of offensive. Does it not? The implication might be that a few of us in this room are a little bit closer to the ape side than others. And that could be kind of offensive. Would you agree? I would as well. So we've got to soften the blow. That's an offensive thing to tell somebody. You kind of resemble an ape. That's a pretty offensive thing to tell somebody. So we've got to soften the blow somehow. So the way that we've got to soften the blow is in one of two ways. We either soften the blow by saying, no, apes are really a lot more people-like than you think, or people are a lot more ape-like than you think. Yes? Or some combination of both of these. Okay? So, but before we dive into what the evolutionists are going to say and say that we're all walking and talking apes, what does the Bible say? Let's turn to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. And by now, hopefully you know where we're going to what it says there, but it doesn't hurt to read it again. Genesis 1, verse 26 through 28. Okay. So, there you have it. God says, this is the moment. where humankind comes into existence, where we are created. And you'll notice that when we are created, does mankind have an equal in the animal kingdom? Are there other animals that are equal to man, or is man special? Mankind is special. None are his ancestor. None are his equal. He is a unique creation of God. And what makes him so unique, God says? He's going to make God in his own image, in his own likeness. Okay? Now, let us now turn to Mark chapter 10, verse 2 through 6. Our gospel reading was from Mark chapter 10, right where we were at, very near our gospel this morning. Mark chapter 10, verses 2 through 6. Okay. So, when does God create them? There in Mark chapter, in verse 6, in the beginning, right? God made them the way that they are today from the beginning. From the beginning, you have been made male and female. From the beginning, this is the way you have been made, okay? This is the way it has always been. Interestingly enough, Adam and Eve, I think, recognized this fact. Did you know that Adam and Eve recognized the fact that they are the beginning? They are the ones for whom an entire species of people is going to be created. Do you know how I know that? Genesis chapter 3. Let's go to Genesis chapter 3. Back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 20. Because we've got to give Eve her name. Where does Eve get her name from? Genesis chapter 3, verse 20.
Adam named his wife Eve because she would become the mother of all living.
Yeah. Why is she named Eve? He calls her that name because she's going to be the mother of all human beings who are going to come after her. Okay? Interesting enough, he also gives her, in Genesis chapter 2, we get that what other name does Adam give her? He also calls her woman. Remember that? We also read that, and she shall be called woman, he says first. That's kind of interesting that he calls her woman first. Woman? But then, in Genesis chapter 3, he gives her name. Her name is Eve. And she gets the name Eve. Why? Because she's going to be the mother of all people. Okay? All people come from Eve. Okay? Now, one last question. Are human beings simply animals? Are we animals? What do you think? Are we simply animals? Is a human being essentially before God, in the sight of God, in the sight of each other, are we simply animals, like all the other animals that we find out here, dogs and horses and cows and pigs and... No. Human beings are unique. They are special. They are not merely another animal. How do we know? 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We could get there a number of ways, but this one's a good one because it's pretty direct. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 39. Okay. Verse 39. Anybody got that one for me? Yeah. Are we the same? Are we merely just another animal? No. No. We are unique and special creatures of God. Ones, by the way, we have a very special relationship with God. Okay? That is one of the kind of the gifts that we're given. Okay. Anybody have any thoughts thus far? Questions, concerns, thoughts? The scripture is, I think, quite clear. Are we unclear? Anybody unclear? Jason, you unclear? You're clear. Okay. Your glasses are often pretty dirty. I'm not sure if it's clear or not for you. All right. Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. So, when we talk about biblical creation, we are now quite clear that God created man, Adam and Eve, that they were there from the beginning, that they had a purpose, that they are special, that they are unique, they are not animals. We're all good on that. That is the biblical point of view. Okay, so what does evolution then claim? What's evolution going to say? Evolution is going to claim that human beings are not original. Human beings are merely another animal, just like others, yes? Right? There's going to be a rejection of all of the things that we just said. So if we're going to study history as an evolutionist, is it permissible to ask whether or not humans were created from God and are special and unique? No. The only permissible question for an evolutionist to ask is, from which ape did man evolve? Yes? I love that. It kind of reminds me of that old army question. Like when they tell you to do something, they tell you to jump, what's the only question you can ask? How high? That's right. Well, for an evolutionist, it's kind of like that. The only permissible question, if you study the world from an evolutionary point of view, is not whether or not man come from apes, but the only permissible question is from which ape. Okay? Now, for the evolutionist, most do not believe that man evolved from any ape that is now living. Okay, so you don't go down to the zoo and look for your Uncle Bob, down at the zoo and be like, well, that orangutan, I don't know, he kind of reminds me of your dad, and no, okay. Even they don't do that. So they don't claim that humans are descended from any living apes, but that also then limits the study quite a bit. Because you are not related to any living apes, the only thing you can study then are fossils, right? The only thing you can study are fossils. And we've already talked about some of the issues we have from getting there with fossils. But what they're really interested in, more than just ape fossils, is they're constantly looking for what they call the intermediate fossils, right? An intermediate fossil is that fossil which sort of looks like half ape, half man, because they're always trying to find how did that transition sort of happen. And so they call those things hominoids. Okay, hominoids. That thing that sort of looks like a person but also sort of kind of looks like an ape. Okay? Now, living apes are not hominoids. Okay? Living apes are not hominoids because they are apes. Okay? Now, what do they want to cite as examples of where humans come from apes as proof? And I really want to say this, not because it's true, of course I don't think any of it's true, but so that you don't hear it for the first time somewhere else and become confused. That you're not like, man, well, Pastor never told us about something like that. I mean, that is really compelling. Okay, so that's why we've got to talk about this just a little bit. So when they talk about human evolution, what then is the case for human evolution that we actually come from apes? What case can be made? What evidence can be cited that says, yeah, apes and people, they're related? Any ideas? Any ideas? Yeah, they sort of kind of look like us. They're also sort of kind of smarter than most animals. Yeah, Yes, maybe. They do some things. They hit rocks together, things like that, right? So they seem to be sort of both. Number one, they're mammals, which helps. We're not talking about lizards or something. really looks odd. They're mammals like us, and they sort of kind of have sort of faces, and they have hands sort of like things and feet sort of like things, and you're saying, well, you know, that kind of makes sense. Now, part of the problem is, as I said, they don't subscribe to any of the living apes or descendants of mankind. So we only can look at fossils. Now, anybody know what percentage of fossils that are found? Ding, ding. What percentage of fossils that are found are either humans or primates? Either apes or humans. So when we're studying fossils, right, when we study fossils and we find these links, anybody know what percentage of all fossils found are primates or humans? Anybody want to take a guess? Who wants 10%? 10%? Anybody? 10%. Jason wants 10%. How about 1%? 1%. How about 0.1%? A tenth of a percent. 100th of a percent. Anybody want 100th of a percent? 1,000th of a percent? A 10,000th of 1%. Yeah, in truth, the number is about 1,000th of 1%. 1,000th of 1% of all fossils are actually either humans or primates. So what does that tell you? There are very few, okay? The evidence is very, very, very small. You have very little data. In fact, what are most fossils? Just point of trivia. What are most fossils? Anybody know? Yes, sea creatures, like sea creatures and and usually like sea organisms is probably the best way to put it. So not even like fish and whales and stuff, but really like little bitty like sea planktons and invertebrates and little tiny things like that. 95% of all fossils are little tiny sea creatures. Interestingly enough. So here's the problem. Most scientists then who study evolution, did you know, have never actually seen a so-called human ancestor skeleton in person. Most paleontologists and anthropologists that study it, even like the PhDs, college professors, most of them have never seen a single one in their entire lives. They've only looked at pictures, seen things in books, maybe a model of one. They've never actually seen the real article. Okay. Now, one of the things that people cite as examples of why humans and apes primarily may descend from one another is their similarities in teeth. Did you know it's teeth that they consider to be very similar? Okay? And part of that might be because of the bones in your body, what are some of the hardest bones that you have? Your teeth. Yeah, your jawbone and your teeth are some of the hardest bones you have. So oftentimes you'll find fossils that maybe all that you find is either teeth or jawbones. Now, what do the teeth of apes look like compared to people? Anybody know? Never really looked at monkey teeth before? No? Do we have a picture? Yeah, we're going to get to a picture here in a minute. But they have a similar arrangement of teeth, okay? You've got kind of molars in the back. You have like an incisor teeth, just like we do, with sort of some front teeth there in front of it. So kind of the arrangement of teeth is quite similar between primates and humans, although typically primates have much larger incisors, right? Those big like fang-looking teeth, they're typically much bigger, and also the enamel is typically much thinner. Much thinner. Now, when I say typical, I do mean typical. Is that true for all apes and all primates? No. Like, for example, orangutans have thick enamel, just like people do. Modern orangutans and modern people both have thick enamel. Sometimes baboons, for example, have small incisors, just like humans do. So while I say that sometimes they're similar, but actually sometimes they're actually different, sometimes they're not, the point of all that being it's hard to draw any real conclusions, because although orangutan's teeth enamel is just like humans, is an orangutan a person or considered an ancestor of a person? No. You say, well, but what about their incisors? If their incisors are the same, then they're humans. Well, no, because modern baboons look just like yours, but they're not considered people. They're not considered ancestors either. Okay? In fact, clearly teeth say a lot more about what it is you actually eat on a day-to-day basis than what your descendants are. Okay? So if some of us have bad teeth in here, it more has to do with your dental hygiene than your ancestors. Sorry, you can't blame grandma for your bad teeth. Okay? Same thing it goes with these animals, okay? It doesn't really have much to do with their so-called ancestry. It has a lot more to do with what they eat. Now, I bring this up because there have been, particularly in the early 1900s, there was a very strong movement to looking at teeth and using teeth to, quote-unquote, prove that man was descended from apes, okay? In the 1920s, in fact, there was a tooth. It was called the, I'm going to try to pronounce this now, Hesperopithecus tooth that was found in England. It was a single tooth, was the only part of the skeleton that was found. And from this single tooth in the 1920s, it was decided that this was an ape ancestor of mankind. It was funny, in the newspapers, both in London and in the New York Times, there was an article written, you could go back and read it if you wanted to, including pictures drawn, which included the entire person, his wife, his children, his domesticated animals, and even the cave he lived in, based strictly on this single tooth. In fact, this tooth is famous because it was also used as evidence during the Scopes trial. Has anybody ever heard of the Scopes trial? That's way back in like your history class when you're in high school, right? The Scopes trial was the famous 1920s trial before the Supreme Court of the United States that determined whether or not we were going to teach creation or evolution in public schools. I don't know if you remember that. This tooth was cited as proof that evolution was right and that we should be teaching evolution in schools and not what the Bible said. Okay, circa 1925. In 1927, they did some more archaeological work, and they found more of the skeleton, and as it turns out, this tooth that was proof turned out to actually be part of a wild pig. Yeah, but the damage had been done, okay? The damage had been done. Trouble with using teeth alone. But what about skulls? Okay, so if teeth can't give us the answer we need, what about skulls, right? Well, one of the things we dig up these fossils and we find these bones and we look at the skulls and we can look at them and go, now we'll know. We can find out that man really is related to apes because we're going to find ape skulls that look like people. Yes? Okay. Do artists work hard to create artwork that shows apes looking like people? Yes. If you go to any natural history museum, you will find it. It's everywhere. In fact, you'll very seldom actually find actual bones. What you will find is what? Lots of artwork. Lots of artwork that sort of shows people looking apes. Now, real apes and real people's skulls actually look quite different. So, here we go. Let's put a picture. Jason, you wanted a picture? There you go, son. There is our picture for the day. Okay, so what we have here on the right, okay, it is kind of our typical ape skull. And on the left, you might notice, my great-grandpa here, okay? Human on the left. Now, what do you notice are some significant differences between the human skull and the ape skull? Yeah, the human brain area is much bigger. Very good. The human brain area is much bigger. What else do we see? There's some differences. We talked about the teeth. See the teeth? Yeah. See, people like to talk about, well, see, these molars look kind of like those molars. Maybe. What else? What else do we see there? Do you see the slope of the face? What do you notice about the slope of the face of the ape? It's much more laid back, isn't it, compared to humans who have a much more straight up and down style faces. Okay? That's one of the easiest ways, believe it or not, one of the absolute easiest ways to tell whether you're dealing with an ape or a human is to look at the slope of the face. The slope of the face in a human is very much up and down. Apes are always laid back like that. Okay? So before you get caught up in what do the teeth look like, or the jaw bones, or people want to look at all sorts of other kinds of features or eye sockets, you always have this feature. Okay? And none of the living apes or humans are different. Because even like the size of the brain, like Jason brought up, can the size of the skull vary even from human to human? Do we all have the same head size? Anybody ever been to the hat store? How many different sizes of hats are there? There's a lot, right? Because even among us humans, we can vary quite a bit. Well, the apes can too. They can vary quite a bit, although they're still always much smaller. So even that's not the greatest judge. The best judge is the slope of the face. Okay? Good. Now, does having a large brain cavity for a human indicate intelligence? Do people with big heads, are they smarter than people with littler heads? What do you think? No, I don't think so. I mean, imagine if that was true. If that was true, what would we do? I mean, we'd take you down to your first grade class and we'd measure your head and we'd go, oh, Johnny, you have a large head. You go into the gifted class. Susie, oh, Susie, I'm so sorry. You have a little small head. Well, back to remedial math you go, right? Right? If it worked that way, that's what we would do. Does it work like that? No. Of course not. Okay? Of course not. It doesn't. Good. Sometimes we got to kind of state the obvious, you know. Okay. Good. So skulls, though, so having certain similarities within skulls isn't going to be very helpful because, again, we're going to see some things that are similar, but they don't necessarily mean our ancestors are the same, okay? But we're actually quite different. Another place, people are going to look at leg bones, and they're going to say, okay, what do your leg bones look like? What is the carrying angle of your leg bone? Because do apes walk like people? Have you ever been to the zoo? Do apes walk around like people? Well, they do sort of sit on their hind legs, sort of, but do they walk around like people do? I mean, does anybody want to come up and demonstrate what an ape walk looks like? Right? They kind of have that kind of deal going on, yes? Yes. Okay, that is going to have to do with the angle and the shape of the leg bones. It's going to have a lot to do with their hips, okay, the shape of the hip bone. An ape cannot walk like a human, okay? It's not a matter of sociological training or anything else. It has to do literally with the shape of the hip bone. They can't stand upright and walk around like we do. They have to kind of have their legs kind of splayed out at an angle and kind of do almost like a penguin kind of walk thing that they do. So people are going to look at hips, say, if we can find a hip that looks kind of like a human, that must be an ancestor. We're also going to talk a lot about feet. Do apes' feet look like humans' feet do? Ever looked at an ape's foot? Like, no, not really. But apes kind of have almost more like thumb-like attachments, right, on their opposable foot, which is quite helpful for climbing trees and doing things that apes do. Do humans have that? Can you grab a branch and swing from your foot? Most of us can't. But apes do, right? Go to the zoo. You can see them. They do it all the time, okay? So their feet don't look the same. The legs don't look the same. The hips don't look the same. So then how are the ways in which we can create an ape man? We've got to create a credible ape man that people descended from. So how are we going to get there? You evolutionary theorists, what are we going to do to get there?
series of
Right. So we've got to either emphasize, right, some human-like qualities and focus primarily on those, right? So if we're going to look at our skeleton here, we're not going to look at the ways we're different. We're going to just zero in on that tooth right there and that tooth right there, and we're going to declare them the same, right? We're going to focus strictly on the ways that they're the same. That's one of the things we can do. Another thing we can do is we can combine fossils, right? What if we took bones and we kind of mixed and matched them together so that we could come up with something that sort of looks the same? Now, in the history of paleontology, that was trick number one. That one happened the most frequently all the time. From about the 1850s to the 1950s, there were dozens of examples of where that happened, where basically you take an ape and you just substitute out a hip bone, right? And you throw in a human one, and then you go, look, we have an intermediate species here. We have one that looks kind of apish-like otherwise, but they have a human-looking hip bone. Okay, what put a stop to that largely? Guesses? DNA. Yeah, DNA testing largely put a stop to that, because now we can go test the bones and go, guess what? That bone there doesn't go with the rest of those bones there. Yeah. Right. So we can't pull that trick anymore. The other thing we can do is basically we either have to, again, emphasize how apes are more like people or emphasize how people are more like apes. Okay? Does it really work very well? How many examples do we have? Anybody guesses? How many intermediate species are there out there? Several dozen that people claim. Several dozen. Which you might think, wow, that's actually a lot. That's more than I thought. But the several dozen, while being a lot, in some ways also creates a problem for the evolutionist. And the problem is this. The several dozen that they have don't align with each other at all. In other words, you can't create a coherent story from one to the next to the next to the next. One place you find this thing, like for example, in China, they found the famous skeleton called Lucy, right? You might have heard of Lucy and say, oh man, this is a 100,000-year-old humanoid kind of thing, and look at how it looks sort of like an ape and sort of like a person. Yeah, that's very interesting. But then you go to some other place, you go to Thailand or you go to Africa and you find another fossil, and you say, man, that one also looks human-like. But do the two look anything like each other? No. So in other words, you can't actually create any kind of coherent storyline because they all look totally different. Okay? And so you don't get any convincing story. Nobody can actually provide you with a lineage, and that's why you don't see charts like that. You don't see charts that say, look, this is where humanity came from with a nice linear line. They did back in like the 1920s and 30s, but they don't anymore because you can't create one. It doesn't work. Now, why then are there continued efforts to make apes out of men anyway? Why do people keep trying to do that? Jason thinks because they don't want to admit they were wrong. What do the adults think? What do you think, Jill? Yeah, we don't want to give credit where credit is due. I think that's exactly right. Because if mankind was made by God, and God is capable of making mankind, what then does that mean for our lives? Yeah, it means that there's somebody else in charge. There's somebody that you might actually be accountable to, isn't there? If there is no God, or you're your own God, or something like this, who's your accountability to now? To myself. I'm accountable to myself, and myself only. Yeah, if I get in trouble, I have to deal with the consequences, but it's all me. If there's a God out there, then there's somebody who's in charge, who's watching and going to deal with what goes on. So it's really interesting. We have a famous anthropologist who said the following, given all the things we've said. His name is Dr. David Billiam, And he said the following in a famous article that he wrote. He said this: "Perhaps generations of students of human evolution, including myself," he says, "have been flailing about in the dark because our database is too sparse and too slippery for it to be able to mold our theories. Rather, our theories that we subscribe to," he says, "are more statements about us and our ideology than about the past." He says paleoanthropology reveals more about how humans view themselves than it does about where humans come from. And he finishes the quote by saying, "But this is heresy." Article written in the American Scientist. What is he saying? What he is saying is this: that when you go and you look at all these fossils and you look at all these bones, you can choose to look at them in a way that says, man, this is an ape that became another ape that became another ape that became a person. Or you can look at them and just say, look, it started as an ape, it's ending as an ape, it's always been an ape, it started as a human, it ended as a human. You can look at them and see either one. Why? Because there's not really a lot to go on. And the things that are there are very sparse. And so what you choose to say is the truth says more about what? About what you believe than what actually was. And I think that's absolutely true. You can choose to see what you want to see. If you want to see that apes become people, you can convince yourself that apes become people. If you believe that, no, what God said, where we started, that humans were made by God in the image of God, that they are not animals, that they are special, that they are unique, that they have been this way since the beginning, you can easily see that as well. Okay? Now, here's what I wish. I just wish that those words that paleontologist wrote, they should put that should be like a mandatory warning label on any like TV show or documentary or like school textbook that talks about evolution. That, that the scientist says, look, what you're going to hear in here has more to do about what I believe to be true than what really is true. Yeah. Very interesting. Okay, so human evolution. Good. Any questions on apes? Because we've got one other place when you go. Yeah.
Well, it's not a question, but it just reminds me of, we went to the Creation Museum and they had one of those skulls that they say was a transition, or they had the image of the skull. And they were like, see, you can dress it up to look, and they had the same skull, and they had it dressed up to look like an ape-like with fur all over it, and it looked ape-like. And they had it, I wish you could take a picture of this, like, it was really good. And they had it to look like a Neanderthal, and you're like, the art mattered. It made you believe
One way or the other.
one way or another. And the art really mattered. It really made you see. And it was the same skull. So it was pretty
It's just how you dress it up.
good. How you dressed it up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Tom Life came out with a really big book, I guess it was like in the 60s or in the 70s.
Yep.
We would come home, my mother really studied it, and she said there was no way. She studied it for about a year or so.
Mm-hmm.
But they had all those art, they drew them, and they just drew them all. So, when you looked at it,
Yeah.
how they decided it went,
Yeah. And the thing is like I said, but it's artwork. And it's good artwork. It can be convincing artwork, but it really is just that. It's artwork. It is artwork. Because you can dress it up to look either way.
But in the Rachel point, I was just looking up Lucy,
Yeah.
and they really started out with just this many bones.
Mm-hmm.
And then they end up with a photograph of this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's kind of like the exact same example I gave you, one of the bone, the tooth bone, right, where they had done the same thing, where this tooth now had like a wife and kids and family, and you know, I mean, he was next door neighbors to Fred Flintstone, you know, I mean. Yeah, but it's artwork. But the artwork can be powerful, okay? The artwork is powerful. Those images, people can really grab a hold of that and they can imagine it. But that's not the way God says it happens. But the other thing we got to do with evolution, I think, is this. And that is, and this in some sense leads us well into where we're going to go in the future weeks, where I said we're going to talk about Revelation and the end times, is we've got to take evolution now, and we've got to stop looking backward for just a moment. And we need to take evolution and we need to look forward. We need to look forward. So, if evolution is true, what then are the implications going forward? What does it mean for the future of mankind if evolution is true? What do you think? Yeah, right. So what that would indicate is, you know, Daryl here may be a little more evolved than everybody else. The bald guys, you who are going bald, you may be a little bit further along the evolutionary track than others, huh? Okay, yeah? According to the evolutionary theory, right, some members of a species will evolve and some will not. Yes, like for example, are there apes still around today? Yeah, there are. Are there people around today? Yeah. So evolutionary theory would tell us that some of us are going to move on to some higher, more advanced, more sophisticated, more level of awesomeness in some way, and some of us are not. What kind of implication would that have for the world in which we live in today? Yikes, right? So that would mean that maybe some sort of racial groups or maybe some ethnic groups or socioeconomic groups are going to move on to a higher level existence than the rest. It's inevitable. It must happen according to evolution. It's happened billions of times over the centuries, over the eons. And so that is what's going to happen. Are we all going to actually be the same anymore going forward? We can't possibly. Evolution says that's impossible. Things don't just stay the same. Some of us are going to move on, some of us aren't. Maybe in the future there'll be, you know, like the movie The Planet of the Apes, you know, maybe the apes will jump ahead of us, get smarter than us, and you know, we'll all end up in zoos or something. Right? What happens in the future if evolution is true? Now, who believed that? Who believed that evolution was true and that some of us are actually more evolved than others? You know this. Jason. Who believed that? Yes, very good, Jason. The Nazis believe that, don't they? The Nazis are more evolved than everybody else. Yes, literally that is an outgrowth of the belief in evolution. Okay? Now, do modern evolutionists try to deny that? Yeah, because being associated with Adolf Hitler is not a popular position to be in, but it's an inevitable one. Okay, it's an inevitable conclusion. Okay? How is natural selection going to continue to work for modern humans? Must it work? It's a law of nature, yes? If you believe it's true. So why should we care about the weak? Should we care about the weak? What does the law of nature say? No, they're just holding you back, aren't they? What about the old? What about the sick? Should we care about them? Should we care about lesser peoples? You know, if there's people that are poorer, maybe, you know, they don't have electricity or running water, or, you know, that they're, you know, whatever, they're lesser in some way. Should we care about them, or is that their problem? Right? These are necessary outflows of a worldview that believes in evolution. Okay? We know better. We know better. We reject all that. Okay? But it's part of the problem why an evolutionary worldview and a Christian worldview come into such direct conflict, not only around the Word of God, which they do, not only around where do we come from, which they do, but also what is important in life, what's the meaning of life, how does morality work, how should we be viewing the events of the world around us. You know, if a bunch of people die in a tsunami on the other side of the world, evolution says, well, that's natural. Why should we even care? Christianity says we know better. God made all people, and he cares and loves for them, and every single one of them matter. Even, the blind beggar Bartimaeus that we talked about in church today, does God care about him every bit as much as he does as the most powerful, the most prestigious, the smartest person on the face of the earth? Yes. Yes. Okay? The Christian worldview and the evolutionist worldview, they can't be woven together. They are in conflict with themselves. They have to stand on their own, okay? We are either Christians and we believe what God says and all the implications of what God teaches, or we don't. And what I would submit to you is this. Most evolutionists themselves don't really believe it. Do most evolutionists believe that they're on the way to becoming a more evolved species than other people? I don't think so. I don't know how you couldn't, though, if you say, man, we've got billions of years of evidence, and this is the way it's always been, and nature has managed to not only create life, but create all these creatures and all these things all the way up to humankind, and what, you imagine that process is just going to suddenly stop on account of you? Even they don't believe it. So I'd suggest don't follow them there, because even they don't really believe it. Most of them. There are a few pretty sick people out there who really do, and that's not good. And we should have sympathy and compassion for those people, but most people don't. Most people, I don't think, really do, because it's too ugly. It's a world without mercy or compassion. It's a world that just simply says, look, the strong should thrive on the backs of the weak. Yeah, that's not a good place to be. That's not a good place to be. Questions about that? Concerns? Anybody want to argue that one? I'll give you an example of though how we subtly kind of play this, even in our own time and even in our own culture. I threw out the Nazis. They're ugly. They believed it. Did anybody grow up ever watching the X-Men? Ladder. Now, the mutants, some of them are good and some of them are bad, and it's complicated. But really, it is the story of evolution playing out in a children's show, where some of us are going to get better, and some of us are going to just, remain mere humans. Yeah. But do most people actually accept that, like, that is reality? Like, that's what's really going to happen? No. But that's literally what the evolutionary view would hold, is in your future. That some of you, through some kind of mutation, are going to become suddenly way smarter or way stronger, or maybe be able to have lasers shoot out of your eyes. I think who is that guy? Cyclops, laser coming out of your eyes, or whatever they can do, telekinetics or whatever, some kind of superpower. Yeah. Okay, so even in our own culture, we have toyed with this idea, and that's just one example, there are others. We have toyed with this idea of what if evolution really is true, and what would it really be like? And yet most don't even agree with it, okay? Okay, so let's come back real quick to wrap it up. So what then is the Christian point of view? We started it. How does a Christian look at all this? God created the world in how long? 6 days. And the seventh day he rested. Yeah. He created all things the way that we see them. He created Adam and Eve. Okay. He had a plan for us from the very beginning. A plan that is for our good, not for our evil. Yes, and that the bad things that we see in the world around us, the ways in which the world is not right, that it is messed up, in which things are bad, people get sick, they get hurt, they get die, there's poverty, and there's injustice, there's all of these things. All of those things are the result of sin. They're all the result of sin in the world around us. And that God has the whole plan of salvation to deal with the problems of sin. And the problems of sin are enormous. Yes, all of our problems, from sickness to disease to our unhappiness to the fact that people go hungry to you name it, it's the problem of sin. But God has a plan to fix the problem of sin, and that plan was worked by Jesus, right? Jesus came, lived among us, perfect life, died on the cross for our sins, defeats sin, death, and the devil on Easter, and is the beginning of the restoration of creation. That story is going to finish in our next Bible study at the end times, right? When we get to the end, when God will fully realize the full restoration of all creation. Questions today? Everybody good? Any other lingering questions about evolution or creation or any issues that we've talked with that we need to revisit? Everybody feeling good? Everybody? Tom, are we good? You good? Okay. We don't need to talk about geology or potassium feldspar or anything.